morning, everyone. How are we all doing? My name is Oliver Blokland. I'm the Senior Conference Producer at Global Investor Group, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the second week of the ISF and ISLA Securities Finance webinar series. Last week's sessions were extremely well attended, but if you did miss any of the webinars, we will be uploading them this week. Today's session is entitled Data, Digitalisation, and Common Domain Model. On behalf of myself, ISF, and ISLA, it's great to see so many have joined us here today. I'd like to thank our 17 sponsors. Their logos were up on the holding side for their continued support, who have really made this event possible. So do also go to the Content Hub at the microsite where you registered to learn more about their genuine thought leadership and view white paper materials. In today's one-hour conference, we'll have a presentation followed by a panel discussion. And as always, at the end, we have set aside some time for Q&A. We've already received a few questions for our panelists, so if you do wish to ask a question, you can do so by clicking the Q&A button. So do keep sending those through for the panel, and we'll try to answer as many as we can. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the speakers and moderator for sharing with us your time and thoughts on the topics we'll be discussing today. This session is being recorded, and it is now my great pleasure to introduce Phil Morgan, who will be moderating today's session.
Thank you, Oliver, and morning, everybody. So thank you to ISLA and Global Investor for inviting me to moderate what is the fifth in the series. I've seen most of them and been excellent content and debate. Hopefully we're gonna follow in that trend. So today's panel is on data digitalisation and the common domain model. As Oliver just outlined, we're going to have a brief presentation at the outset, really giving a flavour of what the common domain model is, and then we're going to follow that up with the more traditional panel discussion. So before we kick off though, and whilst I'm kind of doing the introductions for Leo, I just wanted to set an audience question that you can kind of be answering while we're going through that. So can we get the question up, please? So regarding the common domain model and its applicability to the securities finance, it is totally needed and long overdue in our non-standardized industry. A nice idea, however, unlikely to get traction given other competing priorities. A solution looking for a problem that is not really there. And lastly, what is a common domain model? So whilst you've got a few minutes to answer that, but whilst you're attending to that, I'm just going to introduce Leo Labbé, who is the CEO and co-founder of Reconcile, who's going to, frankly, is probably the leading subject matter expert in a common domain model kind of area. So Leo's going to spend 5-10 minutes providing an overview, and hopefully for those who have answered number 4, what is the common domain model? Once he's done his job, that'll be resolved. So with no further ado, over to you, Leo.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much to our hosts for extending this invitation. So thank you, Phil, for the introduction. So I'm the CEO and founder of Reconcile. I'm going to share my screen in a second. And whilst I'm doing that, just a foreword about our company and why I'm here today. So Reconcile started life around 4 years ago with an original mission statement, which remains true today, of transforming the relationship between regulated firms and regulators. And the way to do that is by helping them talk the same language. And on that journey, we effectively look to develop that common language as a domain model, and it led us to develop technology and tools to be able to develop that. And at the time when we started that journey, ISDA, so the equivalent trade association for the derivatives market, published their intention to develop a common domain model for the derivatives industry. And effectively, this has led us to act as their technology partner to develop the common domain model first for the derivatives market, but now being extended to other industries. So the introduction question is perfect for what I wanted to introduce, because what I'm going to spend the next 5-10 minutes doing is try to dispel the myth around the CDM or common domain model. And we're going to look at it from the lens of what's already there, which is the ISLA CDM. So I'm going to try and present you what it is, but also what it is not. And first, I'm going to start with an extract from how it's generally presented in one sentence, a normalized digital blueprint for the processing of trade events and actions through the life cycle. So there are a couple of very important keywords in that single sentence, which we're going to try to cover next. The idea of normalized and that idea of standards, the idea of being digital or digital first, as the expression runs these days. And also the idea of trade events and action. Events and actions means it's supposed to be dynamics and not just representing static data. So first, about that first topic, which is standard. And just saying it outright, the CDM is not yet another data standards. So this is a funny picture of describing how standards proliferate situation. There are 14 competing standards. 14, this is ridiculous. We need to develop one universal standard that covers everyone's use cases. Yeah, situation. There are 15 competing standards. So I think that issue will resonate with a lot of the participants, and that's certainly one that resonated with participants in the derivatives market when they started on that journey, where effectively it was already an industry replete with standards, some open source, some provided by market infrastructure or big technology providers, industry, some led by regulators. And effectively, the issue that the industry faces is how to deal with that coexistence of all those standards. And one of the driving idea of the CDM is why don't we try and extend and enhance those existing standards, complement them with logic. And effectively by having business logic attached to those standards and develop them in the same language as the standards themselves, then it means we're going to be able to handle the dynamics and the processes that really support the functioning of those markets. So that's really how the ISLA CDM came about. We need to develop not just data, but we need to develop the business logic that goes with it. And once you develop logic, what you can also develop is effectively the ability to translate between all those existing standards. And this was a very, very important driver from day one, which was, we're not going to go and ask each and every market participant, infrastructure provider, and vendor to change their existing systems. We need to be able to interoperate with the existing. And for that, the logic is effectively a means by which we can effectively encode the mapping between all those different standards. So effectively, that idea of having a translation and not just translation, but also validate all of the data that may be coming from those different platforms. A journey that I like to describe in the derivative space is, you start from an execution and you may have had a workflow that has been provided via the fix protocol. And then you have a confirmation that may be done as an electronic message using FPML. And then you may have later downstream, you may have to report that to a trade repository, and you may have to use the ISO standard. Wouldn't it be nice if throughout that simple journey, which all takes place in the matter of a day effectively, if they were all able to interoperate? So the CDM is effectively providing a common language to be able to do that. Right. So this is the second thing that the CDM is not, and it's a very counterintuitive one. The CDM is not a specific application, product, or solution, and nor should it be. So again, this is a story that should resonate. We finally integrated this solution with all of our other systems. Nobody touch anything or make any sudden movements. So the typical story is you have a solution provider that came to you and you loved the solution and you started to integrate it, and it took you, I don't know, the best part of 6 months to a year. And then a year later, you have another solution provider that provides the same thing, but better, faster, and cheaper. And you're like, what the hell? We've already spent all that effort. I'm not gonna do it again. And effectively, and that same problem is also similar if it's not just the same solution, but it's an adjacent solution for a part of your processing of the trade life cycle that is adjacent to the solution that you just integrated. Typically, those systems do not talk to each other. So it's extremely important that the CDM does not try to be a solution to a specific problem and tries to be that common language between all of those solutions, because effectively the industry is replete with solutions to many of the problems that you have throughout the life cycle. But the issue is how to make all of those interoperate. So it really needs to stay at the platform level to be an enabler of solution as opposed to being a solution itself. So once you have that translation and validation layer between all of those existing, effectively you have that common language to build interoperable solution. And here I'm going to make a hint to the white paper by ISLA and Linklaters that was published around the end of last year, which effectively described that entire journey from pre-contractual and when you're looking to onboard clients to the trade lifecycle and up until termination. And effectively what you see is that you have a very cohesive and integrated journey. And the idea is that you're not going to have one solution that is going to rule them all. What you really need is you need a collection of solutions for these different steps in the process, but you need those solutions to be able to talk to each other. So again, a common language between all of those. And it's also a case of not conferring too much of an advantage to incumbency and favoring innovation, because effectively if you're a new entrant in the market, and you're trying to develop a solution, a lot of the hard work has already been done for you. You don't have to start, from ground zero and having to develop, a data model for the solution you're trying to provide. It's already there for you. And a lot of the business logic and a lot of the libraries are already available. So you can really focus on your competitive edge, which is to deliver, superior user experience to effectively your user. Finally, and no presentation would be complete if we weren't talking about blockchain or distributed ledger. So my challenge was for this 10-minute presentation was not to talk about blockchain and not to talk about a certain 4-letter word that starts with S and that has to do with regulatory reporting. So I will manage to do it on the latter, but sadly I have to evoke the former. But I actually have to invoke it on the negative by saying that the CDM is not some sort of smart contract or distributed ledger technology. But I will conclude by saying that the CDM is designed to support distributed ledger technology applications, but it doesn't need to be deployed on a DLT. And in fact, we are working with a number of providers in the space in derivatives who are not looking to provide solutions that are DLT based, and they are perfectly happy using the common domain model for that. And with that, I will end my presentation and pass over back to Phil. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Leo. Greatly appreciated, and obviously we're going to dig into that in the panel now. And before I make the introductions to the panelists, can we just get the answers to the question we posed up, or the percentages, please? Okay, so we asked about the common domain model. Is it applicable to securities finance? So I think the headline there is 40% of you, or 42% of you, think that it definitely is needed and long overdue. Interestingly, 31%, I guess, combined 2 and 3, are suggesting nice idea, or is it really going to gain any traction? So I guess a slight kind of edge from a required versus not required perspective. And then I guess, not surprisingly, 27% of the audience are really unclear what the common domain model is. So there we go. We've got our homework for the next kind of 45 minutes. No pressure, panelists. So without further ado, we're going to be discussing data digitalization and the common domain model. We've got a really nice broad team to help me discuss this. So I'm going to introduce them, starting, and panelists, if you can go, put your cameras on, Asid, and unmute when you're ready. But starting with Deepak, if you'd like to introduce yourselves. Thank you.
Thanks, Al. Hi, everyone. I'm a Deepak Tilani, partner in the derivatives and structured products practice at Linklater. So for the purposes of this panel, focusing really on the kind of legal aspects and how technology can interplay with the law.
Thank you. And then over to Kieran.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Kieran McGonigal. I'm Assistant General Counsel at ISLA. And among other responsibilities, I lead our legal technology working group and our fintech legal working group, which through those working groups, we work with our members to try and determine opportunities for standardization and digitization of documentation in the derivatives market.
Thank you, Kieran. Over to Martin.
Hi, so I'm the head of product management at Broadridge for securities, finance and collateral management. So I'm very much interested in what's the technology impact, but I also write quite a bit about banking and capital markets technologies for journals, wrote a book about it. So very interested in been researching standardization as a topic in banking and capital markets technology for a few years now.
Super, thank you. And last but not least, Paul.
Thanks, Phil. So my name is Paul Pirrie. I'm part of JP Morgan's collateral product team, and I lead our digital strategy for the trading services business.
Super. Thank you. Thanks all. So this essay question, data digitalization, the common domain model, and I guess picking up on the answer, the fourth answer, what is it? So why don't we kind of start there, and maybe I'm guessing all of us and the audience have a reasonably good understanding of what data is, so I don't think we need to start there. But I think digitalization is an interesting area just to clarify on what it means and obviously how it differs from digitization. So so why don't we kick off there, and starting with Kieran. So what does digitalization mean to you?
Yeah, thanks. With apologies in advance, I'm going to answer this question very much with my lawyer's hat on. And I think, you raised the distinction between digitization and digitalization on the other hand. And I think that is an important distinction, because thinking about digitization, certainly in our world, we're really talking about, for example, digitizing the format of a contract, taking a written contract or a Word contract and transforming it into a digital format, whether that's a PDF, XML, or some other form of markup language. I think certainly when I think about digitalization, I think more about digitizing meaning rather than digitizing format. Sorry for getting a little bit philosophical. And when I think about meaning, I think in the context of a contract, I think it's often important to take a step back and think about what a contract actually is. I mean, essentially a contract is really, certainly, in financial markets, it's really just a series of rights and obligations and a framework comprising a series of events that may occur throughout the life cycle of a financial transaction, and which may have, or which have the potential to impact the nature of those obligations, the nature of those rights, and the broader legal relationship between the two counterparties. So to me, digitalization means looking at those obligations, those rights, those events, and trying to, I suppose, first of all, try and, I suppose, define the common business or operational outcomes that derive from those obligations. So, an obligation to make a payment, for example, an event that might affect the quantum of payments. I think better, rather than sort of looking at the words on the page, better from a digitalization perspective to characterize those by reference to their outcomes. So what are they actually trying to achieve? The next step would be to attribute common meaning to those outcomes. So across the market where people, write contracts and they use different formulations of words, which are intended to achieve common outcomes, better to describe those in the same way. And we'll talk about standardization of contracts, I'm sure, a little bit later in the seminar. And then, as Leo was saying, I think then the next step is to represent those business outcomes or operational outcomes in a digital format. So, for example, through the CDM. And I think then, that's very powerful. You have, all of your contractual obligations, which really are the foundation of a lot of the operational processes that we build around, and a lot of the data that flows in and out of those processes. And if that is all standardized and represented in a more digital format, again, very powerful. It allows users to make business decisions based on their common understanding of those contractual terms and the business outcomes deriving from them. It also allows users to align those contractual outcomes with the processes that support them. And I think, again, that has the potential to allow firms to better optimize their operations, to improve regulatory compliance from a regulator's perspective, to improve regulatory oversight, and also to deliver greater efficiencies and cost savings in the market. And Phil, now you're on mute, I'm afraid.
So we've got to get this right. Thank you for that. And I guess, a bit of a kind of legal slant on that, and obviously no surprise there, given your background and the current role. Maybe from a kind of market practitioner's perspective, Paul, what do you at JP Morgan on the collateral side see as what does digitalisation mean to you, and are there any other words that can be used in place of it in some ways?
Sure, I concur with Kieran that obviously the pre-trade activity, including the documentation, is going to be a foundation of any digital transformation you go through. But what I see is as digitalisation in the securities financing business is going to be a kind of digital journey that we go through over a fairly long period of time. And it'll be dotted with various small incremental changes that will each add a benefit in its own right, and hopefully compounded benefits as we go down that journey. And it'll return those benefits not just to the trading practitioners, the trading parties, but also to the market infrastructure, the regulators, service providers, I think across the whole value chain. And the question really is, how are we going to drive that, I think, because it can be driven from the service providers obviously have a particular desire to improve their infrastructure and to deliver more functionality to their clients, to reduce financing costs, improve the efficiency and speed, and also to hopefully mitigate risk. So that would be driven from that service provider side. From the client perspective, the trading counterparties, they're looking to maintain margin. They're also going to be looking to support the regulatory obligations in as transparent a way and easy way as possible. So I think that the drivers is going to be quite critical. But what I'm conscious of is that I believe personally that it will happen, this digital transformation within our industry. All the independent research that's happened, including the white paper that was referred to earlier by Leo, the conclusions that these papers have come to are incredibly similar in most of the conclusions that they come to. So for me, the approximate direction we're going in is pretty clear in terms of digital strategy. JP Morgan itself was engaged in a number of digital initiatives, with both internally and with external partners like Pyram and HQLX. And these, of course, we have to regularly align to make sure that they're in line with our global strategy, both from a trading perspective and an operational perspective, and that they're in line with our clients' own strategies.
And I think it's quite interesting, I guess, reading up on this, and we're all becoming more kind of knowledgeable in this field. Obviously, you guys are probably already there. I'm playing catch up. But I think the point Leo made around the collection of solutions, I think is an interesting point. Whereas, it's not one monolithic solution that's going to kind of be dropped in big bang. So, Kieran, to take your kind of legal side of things, and again, with my old practitioner's hat on, the lack of efficiency in the legal space was, a massive kind of drag on, efficiency. But I think what you're saying, Kieran, Leo, and Paul, is is essentially these can all be kind of mutually kind of working in their own kind of space, and then as long as the overall overarching kind of direction is right, that might be where we can achieve. So I mean, Martin or Deepak, do you have anything to pick up on that specifically before we maybe go into other areas?
Well, I think it's just worth briefly saying that the vast majority of business logic and data attributes have been stored in systems and managed digitally for many years, but it's in the gaps where the costs and the risks live. So on the legal side, we can't say there's a full legal representation of all the contractual terms in the core processing systems. And also, it's pretty clear that there's many products that are not supported front to back within the infrastructure. So that the bread and butter of a system vendor is actually continually working with our clients to actually get that better representation. But amongst those, it's filling those gaps, which I think is the real meaning of digitalisation. And I think there's plenty of scope there, and those gaps generate significant costs and risks.
Super.
Yeah, and the one thing I'd add to that actually is just on the gaps. It's really interesting. I think that is right, but I don't think people need to be too ambitious. Actually, I don't think. So if I look at it with a lawyer's hat on and trying to transform the data that's represented by legal contracts, I see a difference, for example, between payment and delivery obligations and trying to digitize or digitalize those obligations versus a representation that I am duly incorporated. I don't think, for example, I need to have that digitalized. So I think it is right. There are gaps, but for each gap, I think there is that question around kind of reward that you get for standardizing and digitalizing.
Super. Okay. Well, thank you for that. And I think we can carry on, but I kind of just want to move it slightly. And you know, I guess a lot of us have read the recent ISLA and Linklater's white paper that I think Deepak, you had a degree of input into, I understand. So I guess what would be, and obviously that for those that have not read it, it's called The Future of Securities Lending. So no pressure there. And it really does give a kind of overview vision really of where we could and should or be heading in the coming years. So Deepak, given you authored a lot of it, and because Andy Dyson wasn't available, why don't you give us a couple of minutes? I'm aware it's a 30-page document, but a couple of minute overview of that. And also I want to bring in your perspective, but also Kieran's from a derivatives perspective as well, from the work you've done with ISDA. So I think it'd be good to understand where you see it, the future going or being, but also maybe can we understand lessons learned from the derivative space, and is SFTR a step in the right direction? So if you could just take us in that journey, that'd be great.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I'll try and be concise and weave the derivatives bit in. So and do shout at me if I'm not doing either of those. So first thing, I think it was really useful to sit down with Andy and the team just with a kind of blank piece of paper to figure out what the market might look like in a few years' time. And we tried to be realistic as well in terms of what might be a quick win versus a real challenge, but we wanted to put everything out there nevertheless. So basically, as Leo alluded to, we looked at the full life cycle of a securities lending relationship and asked ourselves a question: is there an opportunity to streamline or make things a little bit more efficient? So to take each of those very quickly in turn, kind of pre-contractual, we looked at KYC and AML processes, and I think the feedback was actually it would be really useful to have the ask that each firm has on the KYC AML front to be standardized, and also for the way in which clients can deliver on that ask to be done on a more centralized basis. So you're not always having to scrabble around for different documents for different asks from different firms. So that was one thing. Then the next bit was, before you generally can start trading, you need to have a kind of master documentation in place, so the JUNSLA in particular. And so one thing that came out from our discussions was actually there is definitely scope for standardizing the agreement. And by that I mean standardizing some of the additional provisions that people include within the agreement. I think that's definitely a point that Kieran can pick up on the derivative side. And then once that's been done, there's a scope for automating the production of those documents, and that's by reference to firms' kind of own templates, as well as the netting opinions and so on that are out there that can feed into, or that need to feed into some of the contractual terms. The other piece is, how do you capture all of the negotiation data? So regulators, I think, are much more keen on knowing kind of what processes were followed. And so you can, if you do contract negotiation online, I think there's definitely a scope for capturing all of the approvals that have been provided. And then for me, most importantly, the data that comes out of the master agreements, generally at the moment, people then have to manually transpose that into their systems. And invariably, they're going to get a bit wrong, and they're going to miss bits as well that they don't think is important today, but it may in the future actually be important. So if there's a way of capturing the data from negotiated contracts and basically automatically downstreaming it, I think there's real value in that. And so that is what has been done in the derivatives market already through, and Leo touched on this as well on his side, through ISLA Create, which is basically an online negotiation, automation, and data downstreaming platform. And that, I think, will become more mainstream in the derivatives market. So that is kind of setting the scene for the master agreement negotiation. But then when you get to the individual loans themselves, actually there is scope again for having the loan-specific data capable of being reported automatically. It's very topical for today. And also for the delivery and payment obligations to again be automated. And that's where, for example, the CDM could come into play. And that again can lead to hopefully a reduction in settlement fails. And that can also be the case at the back end of the trade as well. So when you're at the end, if you automate the redelivery obligations, then again you may reduce fails. And we all know with a kind of CSDR overlay as well that may become more and more important. So that was basically what the paper went into. And as I say, I think there is definite overlay both on the automation platform and maybe to push over to Kieran on how you might go about standardizing additional elections.
Yeah, thanks, Deepak. So I think, Deepak and Martin, I think, have both talked a little bit about the challenges I think that firms face when capturing terms within their legal documentation and digitizing it and aligning the documentation with, as I mentioned at the outset, the operational processes that are designed to support that or to implement it. And the challenge you face, I mean, it's sort of a deceptively simple question in a way. It's really, what is your contract? And I say deceptively simple because I think, you immediately look at the four corners of your contract, in our case, the master agreement, and people, it's an industry standard form. People have been using it for 20 years. It should be fairly straightforward to determine what's in your contract. But of course, the challenge is that people take the standard form and they negotiate it and they amend it, they supplement it, they add new terms, they adjust existing terms within that. And they do that on a counterparty by counterparty basis, such that you have firms with a great number of legacy or live contracts on their books, where provisions express similar or identical concepts, but they're all drafted in very, very different ways. And the upshot of that is that the operational processes then that are designed to implement them are really only ever going to be an approximation of the legal obligations that actually exist. That creates risk, it creates inefficiency. So, as Deepak mentioned, this is a project that this is an issue that ISLA have been trying to address for the last couple of years. And we've done that through the development of a project called the ISLA Clause Library Project. And the ISLA Clause Library Project is really, I suppose in simple terms, an initiative that's intended to introduce greater standardization into the way that firms negotiate their contracts. We began by analyzing thousands and thousands of clauses in the market to try and determine from a purely substantive perspective, so looking past the words, looking at the outcomes that people try to achieve. What are people putting in their contracts? What outcomes are they trying to achieve? if we can categorize that, collect that, categorize it, and classify it, so what is a cross default clause, what types of cross default clause exist in the market, if we collect all of that information, we can then create standard form drafting that people can use to implement that within their contracts. And that is, a number of, I think, very self-evident benefits. You increase the levels of standardization that you see in contracts going forward, but perhaps more powerfully, more significantly, you're perhaps then able to better align provisions within existing contracts, align them with this industry standard classification that allows for greater digitization going forward. I think the point was made as well. I think Deepak made, a very important point that, these initiatives, and through these initiatives, we're not attempting to entirely standardize the market. We're not trying to limit what people can put in their contracts. People can still negotiate to manage risk as they see fit. Similarly, we're not trying to capture everything. It's impossible to do that. There will be a residual 20–15% of the market that we can't capture, but having done most of it, we think it's a very powerful foundation for future digitization and automation initiatives.
Thank you, Kieran, and that's appreciated. And and I think obviously on the derivatives side of things, a huge amount of work has been done. And taking my old practitioner's hat on again, a huge frustration for me in the wider business was the time it took and the capacity it took from a legal perspective. So I think no doubt the better standardization and better automation of that process is ripe for kind of change and automation. So I think probably pushing against a kind of open door in that respect. I think what would be good to kind of get into though is beyond the legals and more into kind of the life cycle, the actual trading, the processing, etc. I'd kind of argue in some ways, hopefully, most firms are kind of further along in terms of the digitalisation journey in that respect, albeit it's not named CDM, than in the legals, certainly comparing to where I was. So Martin, I mean, from your perspective, what's the catalyst to make this happen? Is the CDM, even I read one of your recent papers where you were saying it was a solution looking for a problem, but talk me through the kind of catalyst of making this happen, or words to that effect. Words to that effect.
There's a long history of standardization of data and systems across capital markets, going back at least 50 years to the creation of DTC. And there's a couple of very, very strong themes you see where you've had successful standardization. One is a big regulatory push, which, to use the S word, I think we are seeing in securities finance. The other is usually the existence of some kind of powerful market utility, where basically you have to play by their rules and you have to standardize, otherwise you're going to lose out on revenue opportunities. So these two themes have driven an awful lot of standardization over the course of decades, but you can also see where standardization hasn't quite worked. And because it's very easy to say that CDM's not going to work because we don't have the money, we don't have the focus, etc. But they've always been factors that have actually worked against standardization in terms of just general inertia. The short-term costs are seen as too big compared to the longer-term benefits which you usually get from standardization. And there's also the conflict between the standardization to a large extent reduces flexibility. If you do it well, you still allow some measure of flexibility, but reducing flexibility also reduces people's inability to innovate, come up with new products, which is something we all want in the market. But then on the other hand, I think one of the things which there's good innovation, and there's innovation where basically you're coming up with new products, but they're not necessarily particularly profitable because you're not capturing all the costs. So I think there is a much bigger focus in the industry on just front to back costs of new products. So I think these are the factors that you've seen it play for decades. And there's nothing, and they're all there in terms of actually determining whether CDM is successful or not. And I think I think, but ultimately, I think there are some of those pressures that have led to successful standardization in the past. There's definitely the need for it, but I think we will still need to see how some of those dynamics play out in terms of how successful CDM results.
Phil, I don't know if I can jump in there.
Please do, yeah. Please.
When we talk about the drivers and catalysts behind digitalisation, specifically with the CDM, I think the securities financing market is probably quite close to a tipping point, which is driving the need for someone like ISLA to combine the great brains we have in our industry to come up with a CDM solution which we can share the cost, one, and two, that fits with the industry we're in. Because I mean, when I talk about these driving factors, I think the regulatory change, I mean, this transparency of data is really required in order to meet any future data needs that are going to happen. Any transparency we have, the ability to compound and aggregate that data requires a CDM type model.
How do you, I mean, thank you, Paul. And I guess throw this one out there, and it's an audience question actually, but I think it's a great point. How do you reconcile the digital agenda and the need for a CDM, which the cost of which is significant, with and again, I used to be at bit pains at this, the short-term profitability aims of most businesses, they just don't reconcile. So how do you get through that?
Well, sharing the cost is one way. I mean, if you use an industry association, you can share that cost, and I think you're absolutely right. The investment has to be justified by short to medium term real value, tangible value that can be gained. And I think when we see the margins are being squeezed all over the place, that has an effect all down the chain to reduce costs. There's pressures all down the chain. So I think when you put all of the combined factors together that are driving change at the moment, it helps to justify the cost. And if that cost can be shared, even better.
Well, how do you, again, something that Leo said in his intro around the new entrants, make it standardized and allows it for makes it easier for new entrants to kind of enter the market. I didn't know whether that was from a service provider perspective or a market participant, but I guess both probably.
Both.
How does that sit? Where you've got industry participants and vendors, etc., who have spent a significant amount of IP and actual capex, etc., developing solutions. Does the mutualization effectively just reduce the barriers to entry, and therefore in some ways kind of careful what you wish for? I mean, how does that kind of weigh up? Anyone want to take that?
Well, I think just from the vendor perspective, we want to see a market that grows, and we want to see more profitable clients and more profitable businesses. And I think I can't remember who mentioned it, but I think in securities finance we are at a tipping point in terms of complexity and non-standardization, which I think is acting as a barrier to growth. And I think the regulatory push, particularly things like SFTR and the need for greater transparency, is actually just crystallizing some of the costs and inefficiencies that have been building up for a number of years, which has been a side effect rather than a deliberate aim, but it's been a side effect of innovation and growth in the past.
So does it? I mean, so it sounds like you have to go through a bit of pain, as it were, to get the kind of the larger macro benefits. Is that? I mean, are you seeing anything similar in the derivatives world, guys? Kieran or Deepak? Are there any parallels?
I mean, the one I would draw, again, it's with that slightly legal focus, is on kind of automation and negotiation. So in the derivatives market, we used initial margin as a regulatory kind of impetus to try and encourage market participants to do things a little bit differently. And I think without that, it would have been a real challenge. And so, but what was really interesting was that the push was kind of reacting to a regulatory requirement, but then once you had made that initial push, market participants are then looking to be proactive in relation to that change. So by that I mean they're looking to say, well, that's great, but now can we roll it out for more BAU type products, because we've now seen the efficiencies.
Sorry, Deepak, just to clarify, that push was UMR? Was that driver? Or?
Yeah, so the push was, so maybe take one quick step back. So the idea is to create, with the automation and negotiation and so on of documentation, given that the market had to negotiate a whole new set of documents because of UMR, and so they had never really done that in anger before. Actually, it was a good opportunity to introduce a new way of entering into those documents. And so then what we are now seeing is market participants saying, well, that's great for UMR, but what about everything else? And so the everything else is things like the schedules, the ISLA master agreement. So, and that is now will now be put on to the platform. And then the other ask is, okay, well, that's also good, but why are we just limiting this to ISLA documents? And so it is quite funny how you go from using the UMR in this case as the driver to then the market then pushing you to try and push it out more broadly.
I mean, thank you, and thank you for clarifying that. So Martin or Paul, the S word, I'm going to say it, SFTR. So is SFTR, the Sec Finance's world's kind of watershed moment, like it was with UMR? Does that take us on, start us on that journey?
I think it easily could be. I think it's been quite a painful process for basically everyone involved to actually get the reporting done accurately. But I think we're going to see in the next couple of weeks, as things settle down and we see what the exception rates are, particularly on the breaks on trade repository reconciliation. I think as that sinks in, as people actually quantify the cost, we're going to see whether how big a driver. It's not a question of whether it is a driver or not, but how big a driver that is towards standardization. Because the standardization that drives the consistency, that reduces some of those operational risks and errors, is going to be a fundamental way to actually reduce not just the cost of reporting, but the cost of dealing with the exceptions that come out of reporting.
Absolutely. So I guess moving away from just dealing with the outcomes, but actually hopefully dealing with the root causes that then feeds back into better process re-engineering. I think it's really, and again, obviously having a front row seat for this, it's really quite interesting to see the different types of approaches that many firms have taken. Some firms have like a root and branches approach where we're going to look at the whole process. Other firms have said, well, I just want to report. So I think you're absolutely right. As we come through the next few months, I think it'll be interesting to see what kind of intended or unintended consequences.
I think even the ones, and I saw it before with Amir and Dodd-Frank, even the ones whose focus was just to report, they are going to go through a period of introspection about all the costs associated with it. Yeah,
absolutely. Okay, really interesting. I'm going to try and move us on, just cognizant of time. I think we've got 10 minutes left. So I do want to kind of dive, we've kind of concentrated on the systems, the legals, etc. I think an area that we should cast our eye over and is significant is that of collateral and collateral management. I think what's interesting, again, from when I was thinking about this ahead of the panel, was, again, an enterprise-wide collateral management desk is actually often the first place where derivatives margining, repo margining, and SBL margining actually comes together. And in most instances, in other firms, it's rather disparate. So I guess, Paul, any kind of feedback from the front line in terms of what you're seeing, what your clients looking to do in terms of digitalisation, process re-engineering, use of data, etc. Any comments on that?
Definitely. I mean, I think a couple of things we've discussed already are no-brainers in the pre-trade, the KYC and the documentation, the onboarding. That's got to be sorted out. But what we're seeing in reference to your point, Phil, is that we definitely see internally within JP Morgan and our clients are creating these collateral optimization desks across the different trading entities and desks on a global basis. And in doing that, then they're looking at their global portfolio and they're trying to optimize that in order to minimize their costs and maximize profit. But at the same time, they have higher expectations on their service providers and the market infrastructure to support that global optimization. Because if you have a fragmented infrastructure and you have a global coordinated desk, you still have a fragmented infrastructure. So I think the driver there is for someone like JP Morgan as a collateral service provider to be able to support that global model. And in doing that, one of the digitalization techniques that is appearing is tokenization. And I think this has a very important role to play in the future of our securities financing industry. There are already a couple of initiatives out there. JP Morgan has one it's developing internally, and this has the possibility to really revolutionize our industry, I think, both on the collateral and principal side.
Thanks, Paul. And as I understand it, tokenization in the collateral space, do you want to give a one kind of 10-second overview of what that means to you?
Sure. So rather than having what's called native digital assets, so assets being issued on a blockchain, the idea is that you simply use the legacy infrastructure that we have and you hybridize that with a digital layer in terms of a blockchain where you represent the underlying assets as a token. And that token can then be, if you like, I mean, if you imagine a world where you're able to instantaneously transfer ownership, finality of ownership in real time around the globe, independent of market operating hours, that's a dream. And honestly, it's not that far away.
So it comes down to, and again, huge interest, I guess, across the market is in terms of the mobilization of collateral, the eliminating the kind of cutoff time, so you're not scrambling around, 4 p.m. UK time to get a load of US Treasuries in to meet your margin. It really helps with that kind of transfer and velocity of speed of collateral. So it's really development.
You can reduce your financing costs, possibly open up the market to assets that may have been hard to finance or hard to move previously. You don't need to make any market moves. You simply tokenize them and then use them on the blockchain. It reduces it reduces costs. It certainly improves efficiency and speed. And obviously you can eliminate settlement risk, credit risk, counterparty risk, etc. So
sounds like a no-brainer. Any catches?
Expensive.
There's always a catch, right? So, it comes down to mobilization of collateral, I guess, in some ways. Again, throw it over to the group, but while we're on collateral, on the back of UMR and the waves, 5 and 6 coming in, Paul, Martin, others, are you seeing kind of new entrants into the collateral world? Are they having to kind of mobilize collateral for the first time? Does that present challenges to them, opportunities to the market? Anyone want to pick up on that?
It's hard to say anything other than yes. Yes, there are new entrants. They do have challenges. They're not used to moving collateral around, and all the things that Paul mentioned about the challenges of mobilizing collateral. Even if you're starting a relatively new business, you may have to be doing collateral management, delivery of collateral on a global basis. So these create huge challenges for a whole tens of thousands of organizations.
So is the model, do we think that they'll set up desks to manage that, or will that be an outsourced opportunity maybe for the likes of you, Paul? How does that kind of...
I think the buy side, the small to medium buy side firms setting up their own collateralization desks is still very far away and perhaps unlikely. The big ones, yes, but definitely the idea of just delivering cash as collateral is pretty much gone. Yes, there's opportunities for the tri-party agents to provide collateral services to the buy side, but there's a lot of opportunities. I think, and in general, digitalisation, as we move through that journey, yes, it might even eliminate some of the current roles in the industry, but it's going to create new opportunities for service providers and market entrants as well.
Super. Right, I'm just cognizant of time. I think we've got 6 or 7 minutes left, so I'm going to go to the kind of last question to do a kind of 1 minute around the room, and then we will take some questions. So let's fast forward. I said 2 to 3 years originally, but I think in your white paper you said 2 to 5 years. So let's go with 2 to 5 years. What, in terms of data, digitalization, and the common domain model, which was the panel, where are we going to be in 2 to 5 years realistically? I'll ask one of the lawyers first. I can guess what your answer is going to be.
Well, I'll kick off. So I think there needs to be a will, right? So there needs to be a desire to change things. But I think quick wins are sort of standardizing documentation. I think being able to move people onto a more efficient means of negotiation and downstreaming the data, I think those are quick wins. I think the CDM is ultimately a win, but question mark how quick that would be, to be honest, because I think it goes back to that desire point, which I think goes back to the polling question that you had, to be honest.
Super. Kieran, do you?
Yeah, so sort of reflecting on everything that's been discussed today and our own experience in our markets, I really do, it's been said a few times, we are at an inflection point. The last few years, the last 10 years in the derivatives market, the changes that we've seen, primarily regulatory changes, we spoke about UMR, regulatory reporting, clearing, our market has changed from a bilateral market to a multilateral market, and a lot of the things that we're doing really flow from that. So things like CDM, things like document standardization are all in response to that. So I think for this market, I think that's where the opportunities will come from as well. I think probably this hasn't been mentioned yet, but things even like the pandemic that we're living through, this has, I think, accelerated a lot of these trends. Things like electronic signatures, paper-based documentation. Are we still comfortable with that in the new world? So what is it going to look like in 2 to 5 years? I think you will probably, as we've seen in the derivatives market, see targeted applications of some of these regulatory based operational projects and processes. SFTR, a good example, collateral management, and document standardization. I think it's important to see more of that.
Super. So, I mean, I think the documentation, the AML, KYC, legals, definitely, I think is ripe across the industry for better automation. Interesting to note, Deepak, you said that, while CDM is to paraphrase, is a good goal, it may, it could be a bit further off, which I think is probably how I think of it. As long as we have a consideration of it and we're working towards it, I think that should be a realistic goal for the next, couple of years. Martin?
Yeah, I think if we do this right, well, I'm hoping within a couple of years we do actually have a good common domain model that gets the balance right between standardization and flexibility. But to be realistic, where if things go in the right direction, where would you see that? You would see the adoption of that in interaction between market participants and vendors, and you'd also if things go well, you'd see that as a catalyst to creating new utilities in the market. You're not going to see wholesale re-engineering of people's existing systems, but around the edges and in the interactions between people, that's where you could actually see some real progress and benefits.
Interesting. Thank you. Paul, anything to add?
I personally hope that we have a solution for KYC and smart contracts in place within less than 2 years. That would be a very, very useful thing to have. And I believe we'll also see real-time swaps and repo trades happening intraday. I think that should be within 12 months. We'll be seeing that. Perhaps relying on tokenization, perhaps not. But I think digitalisation is going to really impact our industry in that respect and enable us to be able to use collateral in different time zones during the course of a 24-hour day.
Super exciting. Yeah, I mean, a lot to kind of, and I think it's going there, right? I mean, I think SFTR, I think people's appetite, I just think you can kind of feel it in all the discussions we're having. So I think we're coming, now we're out of the kind of meeting the regs, hopefully, obviously as of yesterday and October for the
very optimistic.
It's more about kind of like, okay, what next? What the process? Yeah. I think so. We're actually moving hopefully into a kind of really interesting phase. I think the slightly question mark is a budget in market participants' budgets for it, because as we all know, if it's regulatory, you can generally get a budget because you have to do it. I think if it isn't, and it's kind of best practice, or is that going to be, again, picking up on that earlier question around short term versus long term, it's the right thing, but frankly, you've got to kind of, you're worrying about kind of today and tomorrow, not 5 years time. So I think that'll be really interesting to kind of watch. The question I had, I'm just throwing it over, I know we're kind of virtually out of time, but a couple of minutes to take questions, and just picking up on a question that the audience have already posed. What happens if we don't adopt CDM? What? Who wants to take that? Leo, do you want to take that? You're back on.
Hey, yeah, I think, well, this one was straight directed at me, I guess. So, I might as well address it head on. So, I'll start with an analogy. Let's see, what can you think of an industry where margins are being horribly compressed to the point of, no profitability, heavily regulated, and that's been disrupted by new entrants? What about airlines? So, what I think is the industry shouldn't be complacent because it happens. And, I think airlines were in the same situation. They were like, we're so big, it requires so much capital to start with, we're not going to bother. But if the role that market participants end up playing is just providing balance sheets, which is a complete commodity, and all the innovation and the profitability ends up in other parts, which are effectively the re-platforming of what you are providing, then effectively you're like those market participants are just going to end up like utilities, just like airlines, most big airlines are. So I think, the short answer to that question is yes. And to offer maybe a path forward, and sort of addressing one of the other questions, which is how do we balance long-term benefit with like the short-term cost? So in fact, what we've seen in derivatives is, I think people tend to overestimate the cost, or rather the fact that system transformation has to take place is something that effectively takes place on a daily basis. Like
I'm going to have to call. Sorry, Lee. I'm going to have to, because we are literally running out of time. So I think that's a great summary. Just before I guess we kind of end, are there any other questions from the audience? And I take your point, Leo. In summary, it's defensive for the industry if we don't do it. So in some ways, whether we call it the common domain model or just best practice, better processes, standardized, I think that kind of is the same thing in many ways. We had a collateral question, Paul, maybe for you. Digital cost of moving collateral should be de minimis. However, we need to discard some of the historical architecture to reduce that cost. Expense means you have another added layer. Interesting. So I guess that's building new on old. Do you actually solve the problem? I think that's what that's saying.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think you can increase complexity in the infrastructure without creating additional cost, but still improve it as long as it's fast. You can make it more complex as long as it's faster and more efficient. But I also believe that it is an interim step. This hybrid model is an interim step. Much further down the road, 5 to 10 years time, then we'll be looking at a native digital infrastructure. But I think in order to bring that technology into it and leverage it, you need to create a hybrid layer for the moment.
So just a Segway.
Yeah.
Or a Tesla, or I don't know. So are there any other questions from the audience before I kind of do the quick wrap up? Okay, we've got a question coming in. Will the cost of collateral not be the biggest driver of the move forwards? Hyper efficient capital. If the Paul or the rest of the panel can answer, should we be worried about creating a fragile collateral system because of the general concerns around costs? Anyone want to take that? I think that's kind of similar to what you've just answered, Paul, I think.
I think, increasing collateral mobility is it's a core strategy for JP Morgan and a number of firms. But I don't see, again, I don't think you need to increase significantly the cost in order to do that. The service providers will be pretty much taking the cost in the fintechs and providing it through to the market participants. And provided that doesn't increase the cost of the financing transaction, then it has a benefit to all possibilities.
Do you see the fintechs having a job in utilising that cost across the industry, Paul, or others?
Honestly, I think the way the fintechs approach it, they are approaching it and need to approach it, is they need to get buy-in from those market participants. And when they have the market participant support, then you've got the market participating and effectively paying for their future benefits.
So I guess that leads on, but we haven't got time. You know, are there too many fintechs? What is the future of fintech? But anyway, I'd love to debate that with you. You know, maybe over a coffee when we can physically meet up. But I think we're 5 minutes over time, so I'm getting kind of lots of jabs from the powers that be. So I'd just like to wrap up. I think a fascinating topic, and I think really a real good broad view of it from a legal, systems, collateral management, trading perspective. So I thank you all, the panelists, for making my job easy. So that's great. Thank you to Leo for providing a really kind of easy to understand overview of CDM. So hopefully that 26-27% figure now is dropped like a stone for next time. We'll see. But without further ado, I thank ISLA. And I thank the Global Investor Group for asking me to moderate. And I thank the panelists again for making the job easy and the debate, not quite heated, but a nice debate. So without further ado, thank you all. Have a good day and hopefully speak to you all soon. Take care. Bye-bye.